I wanted to start right in on food, since that food is you. And this is a little quote from Save Me the Plums about Chef Osada-san, who is a friend of yours. For years, he gave me the most exotic tidbits he could conjure up. Pungent fermented squid guts, shiraku, he called the delectable cod sperm, children of the gods, and sawagani, tiny freshwater crabs the size of a tic-tac. So John and I both were saying it's astonishing how adventurous your eating is, and it's become central to your career. So I'd like to hear more about the roots of this, which you do talk about in Save Me the Plums, and how your parents played into it or didn't.
Well, first of all, my mother was, people say my mother was a terrible cook. My mother was the worst cook ever. And I called the chapter about her the Queen of Mold. And I literally grew up watching my mother go through the refrigerator, scraping the blue stuff off the top and saying, little mold never hurt anyone. So I do have an iron stomach. And my mother, who was, she didn't understand that food could hurt you. She had an iron stomach. She was impervious to illness. We went to Mexico when I was 8, and my mother and I were eating everything in the markets. My father and my brother got really sick. My mother and I never had a moment of illness, no matter what we ate. So she was intellectually curious about food. And, I grew up in Greenwich Village, and she would, if she saw something in the market she had never seen before, she would bring it home and say to me, "You like to cook, figure out what to do with it." So one day I open up the refrigerator and there's a suckling pig staring at me. And, Mom said, "Well, cook it." We ate this first sea urchin I ever had. My mother found them in a market somewhere and brought them home, and we ate those. And, this is in the 50s in New York, and my friends all thought coming to my house was really weird because she served things that nobody else was eating. Nopales, cactus pals, and my best friend had never had asparagus before she came to our house. And so I always just thought that eating was part of the great adventure of life, and that you should taste everything. And the more I thought about it, is like, why is eating little tiny crabs, for instance, or cod sperm, any less appetizing than eating a pig's leg? When you think about it, so I ended up spending a lot of time walking around New York with my father on the weekends, and we lived near Chinatown. We would go to Chinatown, and I really understood that. I would watch these Chinese people and think, this is how they go home. This is they're finding home in the food. And then my father, who was German, we'd go up to Yorkville, the German area, and I didn't know until we went there for the first time that he spoke German. And suddenly he's having this conversation in another language, and he buys Kassleribchen, smoked pork chops, and he said, "God, I haven't had these in such a long time." And he was like a different person to me. He was suddenly a German person, and so I started thinking of food as a way of understanding who people were. And food just became a way I was looking at the world. And I've always wanted to think of myself as an adventurous person. So why would I ever say no to anything that somebody wanted to feed me?
Well, let's talk a little bit more about your mother, because we hear about her in snippets through all the books. But then you wrote more about her in your memoir, For You Met Mom Finally, which really brings her to life. And it shines a light also on this whole generation of women who were caught in not knowing should they be having a family and kids or should they have a career. And she was really trapped there. She struggled with that. So could you talk about that and how your vision of her has changed over the years?
Yeah, my mother was of the generation that, really her mother was the first generation to be able to vote, but, my mother was right behind her. And my mom's generation was the first generation of women who were really educated. And my mother and all her friends were very smart, very well educated, and not supposed to work. The 50s came along, and a lot of these women had a great time during the war. And my friend Marion Cunningham, the great cookbook author who rewrote the Fannie Farmer cookbooks, she talks about the war years as the best time in her life. She ran a gas station during the war. And, all these women my mother's age did these amazing things during the war, and then they were told to go home, put on your apron, leave these jobs, the boys need them. And they were supposed to be happy being little housewives. And my mother's friends were angry about it. And they had so much energy. And I feel like I was incredibly fortunate that the one thing that my mother, and she was difficult in many ways, but the one thing that she really gave me was the feeling that I should have a job. That if I did nothing else in my life, I should have a job. And that I should never expect to have a man support me. So I was brought up in many ways the way many women of my generation were not. I was not sent off to college to get an MRS. I was sent off to college to get the tools for me to go out and get work. And as I was writing this book about my mother, I realized what an enormous act of generosity it was for her to give me that, to give me what she never had the opportunity to have. And I really do feel like work has always been enormously important to me. And, I wanted it all. I wanted to have a family and a husband and a job, and I managed to have all of them, and it was really because of my mother.
Let's talk a little bit about your years as a food critic, both in LA and at the New York Times. So, and now I'm blanking on the name of the book, the food critic book.
It's Garlic and Sapphire.
Garlic and Sapphire, okay. So you had decided that you couldn't go in just as you, Ruth Reichl. You had to go in disguise because all the restaurants had your photograph in the kitchen so that they could identify you. So tell us about some of the disguises that you wore and some stories about that.
So the first disguise was, I was sitting on an airplane, and this is, I'm going from LA to New York, about to become the restaurant critic of the New York Times. And the truth is that the restaurant critic of the LA Times, which I had been for 10 years at that point, doesn't have the same kind of power as the New York Times. People in LA care more about what celebrities go to the restaurant than what the restaurant critic thinks. When I'm sitting on a plane and the woman next to me says, "I wish you'd tell me where you're going to dinner tonight." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "Oh, I know who you are." And I said, "What do you mean you know who I am? You don't know who I am." And she said, "Look, I'm a waitress in New York. And we have a huge picture of you in the kitchen with wanted written across the bottom. And there's a $500 bonus to anybody who spots you in the restaurant. So if you tell me where you're going tonight, I can make some money. And I sat there stewing on the plane thinking, I can't tell my readers what's going to happen to them when they go to a restaurant if I'm getting the red carpet treatment. And if they know who I am and they're going to give me the best of everything, that's not fair. So I got off the plane, and my mother's best friend, my mother was no longer alive at this point, but her best friend was an acting coach. And I called Claudia and said, where do I go to buy a wig? And Claudia says, what do you want a wig for? And I said, well, I need to disguise myself. And she said, wait a minute, I'm coming over. And she came over and she said, you can't just put on a wig and a pair of glasses and think, I mean, you can be the restaurant critic of the New York Times. If you're going to do this right, who are you going to be? And I hadn't thought about that. I mean, I just thought, a wig, right? Claudia made me, so she said, who are you going to be? And I pulled my former mother-in-law out of thin air, and I said, I'm going to be Molly Hollis. And she said, so who is Molly? And what does she do? And what do her children do? And where does she live? And I said, well, she lives in Michigan. And she said, well, why is she in New York? And she made me do the whole backstory for Molly. And then we had to get clothing for Molly. We got jewelry for Molly. And then she got a makeup artist to come. And I mean, I was utterly transformed before I was done. And so for the first meal, I take Claudia, who at this point was a little old lady, she was about 5 feet tall and she always wore black. And she was, God, I thought of her as old, but I don't think she was as old as I am now. And so the two of us go to Le Cirque. And Le Cirque was widely known to be a place where you had to be known or they didn't treat you very well. But they really didn't want us there. I walk in and I say, I have a reservation. My name is Molly Hollis. And the maitre d' says, I don't see a reservation here. And I turn the reservation book around and I say, right there, see? And he says, well, I'm sorry, your table isn't ready. Please go to the bar. And we sit in the bar for an hour. And they finally were like, this is the days when they were still smoking and non-smoking. And they finally, reluctantly, give us a seat in the smoking section. We had, of course, asked for non-smoking. And we proceeded to have the worst service you could possibly have. For me, the most memorable moment was, first of all, I was on a banquette and they stored the menus next to me. So every waiter would flip these menus over my way. And then I kept asking, excuse me, can I have a wine list? A wine list, please? I really need a wine list. And they finally bring the wine list, and the Le Cirque wine list is about this thick. And I have opened it, and I've had it for maybe a minute, and the maitre d' comes and he snatches it out of my hands and says, I need that wine list, and gives it to a man 3 tables over. And, the food is perfectly decent, but the experience is really humiliating. And I went back many times in disguise. It never got better. And for the last visit, I called my nephew who was working on Wall Street and I said, I want you to make a reservation for the 2 of us in your name for dinner. See if you can get an 8 o'clock reservation. And he called me back and said, no, I could only get 9:30. And I said, well, let's go. I'm not going to wear a disguise tonight. Let's go at 8 o'clock and see what happens. So we go in at 8 o'clock, and the owner immediately spots me. And there are all these people grumbling because their tables aren't ready. And he parts them, and he comes and he takes my hand, and leads me to a table for four. There are two of us. Table for four. And he says, the King of Spain is waiting in the bar, but your table is ready. And then he says, may I make a meal for you? And it's like we have black truffles and white truffles and caviar and champagne, and they are dancing around the table. And I wrote the review in 2 takes. What happened to Molly Hollis and what happened to the restaurant critic of the New York Times. And I ended up saying, Le Cirque is a very different restaurant depending on who you are. And I knew that my bosses were very nervous about this review. I knew that it was read, and it went all the way up to the editor-in-chief, and I didn't know what they were so worried about. And the next morning, my editor called me, and he said, well, we're in the clear. He said, we were very nervous because this is Punch Salzburger's favorite restaurant. And we were really scared about this review, and you took a star away from them, and it was. And he said, but the first phone call that Punch got this morning was from his friend Walter Annenberg, and Walter said, that is the best review the New York Times has ever run, because he had gone once and not been recognized, and they had treated Walter Annenberg like dirt. So then I couldn't be Molly Hollis anymore because Sirio, the owner, who was so angry, he spent years telling everybody that I knew nothing, I was an idiot. And so I had to be someone else. So one of my next disguises was I actually had my mother's clothing, and I got a silver wig, and I made myself up the way my mother did. And I've never thought I looked like my mother, but I took a photograph of myself and sent it to my brother, and he said, I've never seen that picture of Mom before. I mean, I really looked like my mother. And that was fascinating because I took my mother to 21. And they tried to treat her badly, and she wouldn't have it. I mean, I channeled my mother, my mother was a nightmare to go to restaurants with. My father and I always wanted to crawl under the table. She sent everything back. The martini wasn't cold enough, the soup wasn't hot enough, that it was just, I never sent anything back. I'm not a squeaky wheel, but my mother was the squeakiest. And there she is, I'm channeling her. The martini isn't cold enough, I send it back. And I saw what happens to demanding people. I mean, it was like what had happened to Molly Hollis would not have happened to my mother. She wouldn't have stood for it. It was an interesting lesson. Then I had one of my favorites was Brenda. Brenda was a wild redhead, and this incredible red wig. And my elevator man was in love with Brenda. He never got that I was Brenda. And he used to say to me, when is your friend Brenda coming? And my family liked Brenda better than me. She was so nice. Brenda was a kind of free spirit who didn't mind waiting in line, was the kind of person who talked to people all around her. And then people would say, you want to taste this? I mean, she made friends with everyone. She was very fun to be. And she was sort of my lesson that you really do catch more flies with honey. But maybe my favorite was Chloe. Chloe was a blonde. And I found at one of those resale shops a Chloe black silk cocktail suit. And it was very elegant. And Chloe got long red nails and a lot of makeup. And she was this soignée blonde. And for my favorite moment with Chloe, I went to a restaurant that had a really beautiful bar. And I did not take my husband. He wasn't happy about this. But I went and sat in the bar and waited for a man to come up and say, are you eating alone? Would you join me for dinner? Which, in fact, happened. And I want to tell you, there is no disguise more effective than being with someone who doesn't know you're in disguise. I mean, it was like restaurants would say, you know, we knew who you were. And I guarantee you no one ever knew who Chloe was. I mean, she was a really good disguise.
So your husband saw you and Chloe go out.
Yes, he did. He wasn't happy about it. And then you want to know my most embarrassing moment.
Yes, we do.
In disguise this was when I was my mother, and I went to the hottest new restaurant in New York, forgetting, because if you're at the New York Times, you were not allowed to be part of the James Beard. I mean, they said, we pay for your opinions, you can't give them to anyone else. So I had completely forgotten that it was the James Beard weekend in New York and that every chef in America was going to be, and of course, where would they go but the hot new restaurant in New York. So I'm sitting there as my mother, and Wolfgang Puck and Barbara Lazaroff came in. Well, I spent an entire year writing a story about Wolfgang and Barbara when they opened Chinois in Maine, their second restaurant, during which time they got to know my mother. And Barbara comes in and takes one look at me as my mother and bursts out laughing. And as every chef comes in, Barbara goes up and whispers to them. And they all start parading past my table. And I'm so humiliated. But the final humiliation is Julia Child comes in. And Barbara goes up and whispers to her. And Julia says in that Julia voice, "There's Ruth Reichl! You wink!" And the entire restaurant turns around and looks at me. I wanted to die.
We could hear those stories all night. But there's so many other things to talk about. And we have some people in the audience who are huge Gourmet magazine fans and have every issue. And it was an amazing time in your life. So I would like you to tell them something about what it was like being editor-in-chief of that magazine.
First of all, you know, when they called me and said that they wanted me to be the editor, I mean, I was the restaurant critic of the New York Times. I have no business background. I had no management background. And, you know, when they said, we want you to become the editor of this magazine, I said, you know, you're crazy. I mean, I'm not remotely equipped to do that. And, you know, then it turns out I had redone the food section of the LA Times, and Cy Newhouse knew that and been told, I don't think he actually read it, but he had been told by people that it had been the best food section in the country and that I had done a remarkable job with it. And, you know, he kept saying, you know, I want you to make the best food magazine and you'll have all the resources and you can do anything you want. And, you know, I kept saying, no, the time's not right. And eventually, you know, my husband said to me, I mean, how can you say no to this? I mean, this is like the Bible of American food. And you keep talking about how food in America is changing and that the magazine hasn't changed with it. And you can do anything you want and you're crazy. Do it. And, it was really, I mean, the first few months were really awful because I really didn't know anything and I kept making really stupid mistakes. But I was really blessed in that I took over a pretty unhappy magazine. I mean, the way it had been edited before I got there was the 3 editors at the top made all the decisions. And then they basically went to the editors and said, here's the story you're going to edit, here's the story you're going to edit. And I was really shocked when I got there because when they were showing me around, they said very proudly, we have the next 2 years completely done. They had every article for the next 2 years edited, ready to go. And I said, but magazines are supposed to be timely. And they said, well, we like to think of ourselves as timeless. And I just thought, this is not how I want to run this magazine. And I called a meeting. Well, it turns out they'd never had a meeting. There was not a room in the building large enough for the entire staff to be in. So when we had this first meeting, people were sitting on the floor and on each other's laps and on desks, and just standing. It was really, and I thought they've never had a meeting. Nobody's going to say anything. But I said, look, I don't want to run this. I want us to do this together. And what do you think we should be writing about that we haven't? And I didn't say another word for 3 hours. I mean, I had this group of smart, passionate people who had really great ideas about what they thought we should be doing with magazines. So it was the most wonderful, collaborative, exciting. And I would go into every meeting. We would, decide, okay, we're going to do an issue about farms. And then I would come out and think, I wonder what that issue was going to end up like. It's so much fun to watch it grow and change. And, it was another time in publishing. I mean, there will never be another magazine owner like Cy Newhouse who really didn't care about making money, just really wanted to make the best magazines he possibly could. Although when Condé Nast started being successful, he was very proud. But he really believed in the audience. I mean, he believed that if we gave people a quality product, they would pay for it. And I mean, it is such a privilege to have all the resources you could ever want. I mean, for me, the great moment at Gourmet from an editorial point of view was I called Binky Urban, who was probably the premier agent in New York, to ask her if one of her writers would work for me. And she said, I don't understand it. Suddenly all my writers want to write for Gourmet. And we got great writers to write for the magazine, and that was really, it was exciting, to get, I mean, I had been on book tour with Ann Patchett, and I called her and said, I want you to write. And she said, Ruth, I mean, I'm a vegetarian, I don't really care very much about food. And I said, yeah, but you can write about magic. If you can write about magic, you can write about taste. And not everyone can. And she wrote amazing stuff for us. I mean, actually, when the magazine closed, she wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal called I Killed Gourmet. And when she wrote, and it was true, she said they would let me write about anything I wanted. So when she wanted to write State of Wonder, she said, will you send me on a cruise down the Amazon? We said, sure. Actually, my favorite moment with that was her editor was our travel editor, whose name is Bill Sertle. And he came into a meeting late, and once, and he said, "I'm so sorry, I was on the phone with Anne, and she called, she's in the Amazon, and she's at a market, and she wanted to know, she bought a turtle to save it from going into someone's soup pot, and she wanted to know if she could expense it." His name is Bill Sertle, and he instantly said to her, "Yes, we have a strict policy at Gourmet that any writer can expense any animal that rhymes with his name." And we spent the rest of the meeting figuring out what other animals people could buy and charge us for.
I want to go back to what it was like for that ending, but there's something else I wanted to talk about first. I read Save Me the Plums recently, which was long after I read the Paris novel. So I came across this quote. This is Ruth talking. "Afterward, I wander through crooked streets until I find myself in front of an elegant vintage clothing shop called La Petite Robe Noire. The place looks so forbiddingly chic that I hesitate to enter. Inside, a woman, her black hair cut into a Louise Brooks bob, caresses a small dog. She looks up, catches my eye, and waves me imperiously in. I have the perfect dress for you." She lifts a cloud of black lace from a hanger. Cradling the armful of froth, she leads me to a corner of the shop, roped off in black velvet, and waits as I remove my clothes. As she slowly lowers the dress over my head, I notice a label sewn inside, Severine. And I said, wait a minute, that sounds really familiar. So I look it up in the Paris novel, and this is what she wrote. Sheltered by the curtains, Stella slowly removed her clothes as the woman began the tedious work of unfastening the tiny buttons. Humming happily, she held out the confection, gesturing for Stella to bow her head. As the garment fell, Stella caught sight of a hand-sewn label, Christian Dior, written in black thread on a small rectangle of white silk, and just above, Severine. Stella said the word out loud. And I said, well, you found that whole beautiful scene from your own life and had the sense to transfer it into this book. So I want you to talk about that.
I didn't have the sense. Oh. It was my editor, the late, amazing Susan Cowell, who said to me, when I have a 5-book deal with Random House, so I still owed them 2 more novels at that point. And Susan said to me, I love that scene. I love that little black dress, and I so wanted you to buy it. Don't you think you could write a novel where the character buys the dress and her life is transformed? And the minute she said it to me, I saw the book, and I suddenly realized I could put everything I really love. I mean, I could put food, and I could put art, and part of it was I immediately thought about Victorine, and this woman who had been the model for Manet, who I had always wanted to write about. And I saw the whole book like that. And the thing that is just breaks my heart is very unexpectedly and very quickly, Susan passed away 4 months later. So she never read the book. But I do feel like she was kind of sitting on my shoulder as I was writing the book. And Susan had this way of, in her pencil, she would go, oh no, when he did something that she thought was too much. And so as I was writing, I kept hearing Susan going, oh no.
So writing comes easily to you then?
Oh yeah, right. just like it comes easy to you, right?
I think we need to stop and take some questions, but we can't really see. So if you would stand up if you have a question, and then we'll try to repeat it. There's so much to ask her. Okay, okay.
Just because I also like to write. I'm curious how difficult it was for you to transfer from writing for publication like the New York Times or Gourmet magazine to actually writing novels.
So the question is, what was it like to basically go from nonfiction and journalism to writing fiction? I love fiction. I'm addicted to fiction. It's my drug of choice, and always has been since I was a little girl. And I always said that if I didn't have a day job, I would write a novel. And so Gourmet closes, and for the first time in my life, I don't have a day job. And I thought, oh my God, I guess I have to write a novel. And I have to say, so my first novel, Delicious, took me a long time. And I got a lot of help from Susan Campbell. And Susan was a legendary editor. I mean, she was Salman Rushdie's editor, Gary Steingart's editor, and Elizabeth Strout's editor. And at her memorial, we all said she was the best editor any of us had ever worked with. But I deliberately got her as my editor because I knew I would need help. But it was very slow. And I had always imagined that writing fiction would be like reading it, that you would be in the book. It wasn't like that. I have to say that the Paris novel was pure pleasure. Every day, I would take my computer and go to my studio and say to my family, I'm going to Paris now. And it was like being in the book. I mean, it was like what I had always dreamed of. And I don't like to write. I don't know very many writers who do. I actually liked it. It's the only thing I've ever written. In fact, when I sent it to my agent, and this was very, very different in that because Susan was no longer with us, I wrote the entire book before anybody read it. I didn't send it to my editor. I just kept it until it was done. And when I sent it to my agent, I said, there's no way this is any good. I had way too much fun writing it. And she read it over the weekend and called me the next morning. She said, you're never allowed to write anything you don't like. You've got to have fun with it. And I'm writing a sequel now, and it's fun too. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Well, I think I speak for a lot of people when I say how much I miss Gourmet. It was so wonderful. But I was thinking recently about the changing landscape of food in the sense of when we look at the politics of it, food has gotten so expensive for working people, they can't eat healthy, they can't afford produce. And then money people can go to restaurants where they can spend $70 on an entree. And then there's also the role that food plays socially. When I was a young wife and mother, we ate in one another's homes. And I really miss those conversations that went on and on and on. Now people will say, let's get together, and we go to a restaurant. And we don't have the same quality of conversation. So I just wanted you to comment on how you see the food landscape changing.
Okay, so the question is, how do I see the food landscape changing? Because we all know how different things are than they used to be in so many ways. And let me say first that if you had told me when I was young and one of a tiny handful of people who cared about food, that we would live in a world where food was part of popular culture, I would have told you were crazy. I mean, I feel like I grew up in an America that was indifferent to food. And that is not the case. And I'm grateful for that. And that as recently as 2006, I was asked to speak to the newspaper editor group. I mean, they have the editorial writers for newspapers have their own group, and they asked me to speak to them. And at the time, I gave a speech about the environmental disasters, about how we fished out all the big fish out of the sea, how pesticide runoff was making dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, how the confinement animal facilities, and I did all of that. And the thing is, and I said, you've got to write about these issues. People need to know about them. And none of them knew about them. It was such new news to them that they actually printed up a version of my speech and sent it out to everyone. And, things have changed so much. You couldn't make that speech today. You couldn't have even made it 10 years ago. People started knowing about these things, and that's, I think, a really good thing. You also have a generation of young people who care deeply about food justice, food inequality. They care about food waste. There's a reason why, at least a third of people under 30 are vegetarians for more. This is a huge change in America. And I did, during COVID, I did this documentary about our food landscape. And, one of the things that we lay out in this documentary, this is mostly about farmers, but one of the things we lay out is that at the end of World War II, the American government made a very clear decision that how we were going to fight communism was by having the cheapest, most abundant food in the world. And it changed food in America completely. Farms turned into factories, essentially. The changes between 1948 and 1960 on the American farm were horrifying. Before then, they were not using antibiotics to make animals grow faster. And farms were not run like factories. And then you have the farm crisis of 1982, when thousands of American farmers went bust because the Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, had told the farmers to get big or get out, encouraged them all to take out enormous loans. And one of the farmers that we have in the movie, they lost everything in the 80s because they did mechanize and completely changed the way they were farming. And literally, they lost their house, their mother's car, every piece of land they had. And the effects of that policy have been devastating. It's why we have 6 out of 10 Americans have food-related chronic diseases. Because we have fed at least 2 generations industrialized food that are empty calories and bad for people. But until we really understand that, for years, I stupidly went around giving this speech that said, we vote with our dollars, we can change things, the great thing about food is that consumers have power. That is nonsense. We vote with our votes. And until we start caring, sorry, I shouldn't be going down this path, but until we start asking our politicians, what are your policies on food? What are your policies about making sure that there is healthy food available to people? What are your policies on giving subsidies to family farms instead of corporate farms? We are not going to get any better. We can't do it by ourselves. We subsidize all the wrong things. We subsidize corporate farms to the tune of $50 billion a year. If we gave that money to small farmers, we would eat differently in America.
we have time for one more question.
Over here.
Okay.
Can you comment on what you feel Google review or Google star ratings on restaurants have done to the whole industry, and how this become hyper-focused by every person that goes to a restaurant, and maybe it's hard for a restaurant not to, falter or screw up and then have a bad review and that kind of thing.
Okay, so, the question is about, all the reviews online of restaurants and what that has done to the industry. And I think the results have been both good and bad. The good result, when I started writing about restaurants, you had a few people who had voices that were way too big. Ultimately, if you're the restaurant, you're just one person, and, there is not really a right and wrong, it's your opinion. Suddenly you're getting a much greater landscape of opinions. And the people who consume those opinions have to be smarter about it. When you go online and look at a review that's a crowdsourced review, you have to know that some of those people are going to be friends of the restaurant, the aunts and uncles and parents of restaurant owners, and some of them are going to be their competition. And you have to be really smart about how you read those and take everything with a grain of salt. What it has also meant is that the few professional critics who are still being paid are probably better than any have ever been before, because they have to be. They're dealing with a much more knowledgeable audience. And if they're going to be paid for their opinions, they better be giving you more than just, consumer reports on how to spend your money. The critics need to be real critics, which means that they give you, if you read, doesn't matter whether it's a restaurant critic or a theater critic or a book critic, that person should be giving you better tools to appreciate whatever experience you're about to have. And if they're not doing that, if they're just giving you, I liked it, I didn't like it, they're not doing their job. And I think that you now have the people who just want to give their opinions are doing it on the Googles and the Yelps. But the people who are doing real criticism are doing criticism that is much better than anything we've had before.
Okay, we better stop there. Thank you all for coming and being friends of the friends.